I also worked at Google. Seems like it's a common thread. But I was not forced to use Blaze. I was forced to use Make because I was working at the time. I did a lot of things, including SRE, over the same years you were in SRE. That's interesting. I didn't know that. I was in the New York office at the time. I was working at this point, working on firmware and hardware platforms, data center hardware platforms. And a lot of that junk was running on Make files and bailing wire. And the network stack people in particular had an interesting story because they tried to migrate their code base over to Blaze. And then they put it to a new hire, so it didn't get done. And so they kind of gave up on the project, but then they had a major problem where they upgraded all the workstations and the build didn't work anymore. And they're like, maybe we should have a hermetic build system. I was like, yeah, you're at Google. Anyway, so they ended up, I got involved with that migration. And then I, also when Bazel came out, I was like, oh, I can use this for a personal project that's too small for it. But it actually solved a lot of problems for me. And lo and behold, I became a Bazel aficionado.
Well, before I showed up at Google, early in my career, I was at a Microsoft shop, and everything that was not code, SLN files, VCX prod files, were just a giant ball of mystery that people would bang their foreheads on and put up for review. And so arriving at Google the first time, and day one, they show you, hey, this is how to write a build file. And it's all very straightforward. List your source files, list your dependencies, and then your build is magically sharded out over hundreds of machines for free. And I've been enamored with the technology ever since.
It's always free, but somebody else's money, right? All right, questions?
All right, I don't know what my question is really, but Bazel has been pushing for build without device, right? As the default option. But there's also BB Client D, which I think Benjamin has been working on for a while, and Ben as well. I personally think BB Client D is a better choice for interactive builds, but I'm wondering what you have seen when deploying Buildbarn to many different users and what your experience has been with the two options, right?
I mean, if you're not using the bytes, there's really no point to running BB Client D. Then going without the bytes is going to be as fast as you want to go. But BB Client D really gives you the opportunity when you have workloads which needs some of the bytes some of the times, and you can't really say which bytes you need. That's where it really shines. I wish there was a little bit better way of doing some things, because it's still kind of like a semi-local things, semi-remote things, which makes the network's latency to the upstream cache servers a very important link for you. But it's a very neat compromise when you need some of the bytes, but not all of them. Have anything?
Yeah, exactly what Benjamin said. Like, managing that fuse file system isn't free, right? There's some inherent overhead to it. So if you can live with remote download minimal, you really just care about seeing the build pass or fail, then it's probably not worth using BB Client D. So for example, for a CI system, it might be smarter to just use remote download minimal. And if you do need access to certain assets, you then do like a follow-up build where you say, but this I want to download the top level, or use what's again the blah 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 regex flag that they added nowadays, where you can sort of pass in a regex to specify which files you download, because the advantage of that is that also Bazel will download it in parallel, right? Because it has a workable. But if you go into the fuse file system and you access a file, then that typically happens sequentially. Like most Unix file system stuff is all sequential, right? So this is really meant to be mostly be used at desk, right? Where you're just hacking around and you just want to explore stuff, right? That's a takeaway. So the offer of BB Client D say don't use BB Client. No, that's exaggerating, but you get the point.
Yeah, I want to underscore one thing that you said about don't use it in CI. I really don't think there's any reason for that. I'm adherent to the best part is no part, and it just adds complexity. You can always specify what you need if you needed it. Remote download top level is mostly all you ever really needed in CI anyway. If you need some specific targets, just say those targets on the command line, you'll get those top levels. But for user experience, I think that especially coming from other build systems, they're used to having a completely filled out Bazel, well, they wouldn't call it Bazel out, it might be called Target or Build or whatever, but they're used to having an output directory that's fully populated. And especially if they're used to certain workflows, I think that having the option to be able to just point your tool at it, even if the download story is not as optimal, ends up being a good enough workflow if, as you pointed out, and one of the two of you pointed out, that the link ends up being really important. And we had that problem here at Snowflake where at the time, all of our builds were being done on VMs on MacBooks. And everyone hooked up to the junky Wi-Fi in the, in the break room or whatever is not a great story for that. And so we actually had a bad experience with BB Client D because of it. And we ended up just going to download everything, remote download all. And then using the dynamic scheduler to sort of paper over that. But and we're still running in that mode today, but I think what really prompted Julio's question was we were kind of exploring going back to BB Client D now that we're doing builds on workstations that are in the cloud where we have a good link.
One tiny thing I also wanted to mention, if you have like many people sitting in an office using BB Client D, well, surely Wi-Fi will surely end up being a bottleneck, but regardless of that, it's for those kinds of setups, it also makes sense to set up like a local office cache kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right, so that you configure BB Client D in such a way that it can even do dynamically, so that if the office cache were to go offline, it automatically falls back, but that you sort of have a pull-through cache in the office for CAS objects. That saves a lot of at least long distance bandwidth.
Yeah, actually, I have a compliment story to that because our Berlin office was having trouble, in particular their internet connection. Of course, they were blaming the fact that the farm was actually in US West in Amazon. And it's like, actually, I don't really think that's the problem. The problem is your internet connection is terrible. And it was hard to prove that to them. But we ended up just moving to the BB, just download all the things. And that kind of worked well enough for us. But we had explored the idea of having a in-office cache. That was technically and politically difficult for us to implement because we're such an in the cloud kind of organization. I think a lot of organizations fall into that boat now where on-prem, like true on-prem hardware is just, you just don't have it. Like you got some switches and access points and that's your hardware, maybe a printer,
Coffee machine.
Yeah, the network attached coffee machine.
Hi, my name's Pat. I manage the Bazel infrastructure at our company. We're not a very large company. We're like 40 people. And we all started with people coming from Google or from other company and then Google before that. So we all knew very well Bazel, but as we're hiring more and more people, it's difficult in the training wise to get people used to like do Bazel stuff because we hire a new great front-end TypeScript engineer and they're like, why aren't you using Turbo Repo or something like that, right? Like and stuff like that. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what's your guys like? Do you guys have like frequent trainings? What's like the resources that you have to like train new people and stuff like that? So.
Well, I'll answer partly as a vendor who provides training. I've done a bunch of trainings. The language specific ones are free. I do need to add one for TypeScript. And in those, I tried to show an installation of Bazel that is more idiomatic to what those developers are already expecting. And so I think part of the answer is that Bazel always has this knob you can turn from 1 to 11 of like, how googly do you want it to be versus how idiomatic to the language ecosystem. And in the extreme, when you turn that dial down to 1, there's no reason that developers couldn't continue to run whatever existing legacy build system they're comfortable with. The same configuration file should work under the Bazel rules, right? So as long as your Bazel rules your build files point to configuration files that don't have to be sort of Bazel specific in some way, then developers should be able to choose, right? And so I think that's actually very healthy because it forces developer infrastructure teams to provide an excellent experience, and you can't sort of force engineers to switch to Bazel until it's really good. The other part of the answer is, yeah, of course, providing some amount of training. And I think nobody remembers the training course they went to their first week at a job. You're overwhelmed with meeting everybody and trying to figure out where the bathrooms are. So it's much better to provide that sort of feedback loop in the tooling that developers use regularly. So it's much more important to fix up error messages and prompting and like what the CI system tells you. So that, you know, for example, when a test fails on CI, it should tell you the Bazel command to run.
Can I do a follow-up? I think like the rules in general are going through like the Linux Foundation or like not Google, basically. Do you feel like it's gonna go towards more idiomatic integration with the language, or is it gonna stay with like really pure Bazel, super optimal rules for like non-C++ language, let's say?
Yeah, I think even C++ will eventually fall into this. We'll see what happens. Java, I've already heard hints from the Bazel team that they would love for that to essentially be like a community version of the rules and then what the Google internal teams use. And yeah, I've been a little bit involved in the politics there. The Linux Foundation is a great neutral home to take things, but it doesn't have a funding source behind it, right? Google makes these things for their own purposes, but they do tend to be very complex and they don't do a great job of making them approachable for the less complex use cases or providing really, you know, all of the things that developer relations team would, like documentation and you know, showing up on Slack. The Bazel rules are very heterogeneous in terms of the philosophy that the maintainers bring to the project. And so some of them, like I think the ones we work on, we try to be very idiomatic to the underlying ecosystem in, you know, in the sense of like, there's very little bug surface that's Bazel specific. If you have a problem, you can reproduce it outside of Bazel too. Then there are some other rule sets that are somewhere along the continuum. And, you know, some languages don't have, for example, a lock file. So for Java, like Maven and Gradle don't have a lock file you can just use. And so there's sort of a Bazel specific lock file. And so like some people put all their Go dependencies in their module file and they don't have a Go mod. And so now that breaks the existing Go tooling. To some extent, it's up to you as the consumer how much to follow the language ecosystem. And then to some extent, I think as users of rules, it's a good idea to provide feedback to maintainers to show them what it is you need.
So, yeah, so this was still a question about like, you know, onboarding people. Are there like any other people who have an opinion? Okay, sorry.
I think we found that the like Bazel's target or label specification is kind of like a mini language. Like if you treat it like that and it'll explain to people what all the pieces mean. They're not super obvious for those of us who are like not steeped in it, you know, / the top. And then colon means you're going to a build file, but sometimes the colon's omitted if, you know, the target name matches it. Some of this stuff is not obvious and then they get it and then you're like, oh, and then sometimes there's an @ you know, thing and then that's somewhere else entirely. And
Two ads even.
two ads even
No,
now
two ads.
and pluses and so explaining the target specification and then providing a justification that, hey, once you understand targets and you can pretty much build and test anything outside of your domain, you know, across the whole org, which is the benefit. And the second thing is having good examples. So if you have an example in every language, you like work with each dev team, if you're not familiar with like a particular ecosystem, to come up with an example project that somebody can go into that folder and copy paste that folder to get started, or and then you're making sure that that continues to build over time. We found that to be really helpful as well.
Yeah, there's one more thing on that, because I think it's a really good question. It hits on how do I have a successful migration, as well as how do I make sure that, you know, this doesn't impact our ability to grow. The whole point is that to your point, is that it should normalize the experience so that engineers don't have to be surprised when they move to a different part of the code base or have to interact with some other component. You know, a backend engineer is not going to be as knowledgeable about, you know, NPM or whatever, but Bazel abstracts it sufficiently so that at least they can interface with it. Sorry, there was a point I was going to try that, but I distracted myself on that. Yeah, I think that the ecosystem, from my observation, as we're moving more into Bazel mod, and how many of here have actually finished migration to Bazel mod? That's about the number of hands I expected. All right. It seems to be trying to embrace things like, you know, through the idea of extensions, the idea of like, I'm going to extend the description of my Bazel configuration into this ecosystem. I think that's a really good model. But I also came from that world. Yeah, I was at Google for a long time. I wrote some Java there, but it's Java in the way that Google does Java, which feels like the way Google does C++, which is not the way I found the hard way that Java developers want to work. So, but you know, a Java developer should have a log file. They don't know what they're missing. But yeah, I think that it's a good story to tell. That yes, it has some learning curve up front, but it will empower you in the long run. This is the part I wanted to say that wasn't actually a reiteration, which is because Bazel isn't commonly used on open source projects unless they happen to be sort of like commercially oriented, like, you know, take for instance, you know, the Apsil library or the V8 JavaScript engine or something like that. There's not a lot of opportunity for new hires to have had the experience unless they happen to work for one of these companies that's gone through one of these migrations. And so it's going to be like so many things in the enterprise space where there's new tooling that is going to be enterprise specific. And so for a small company like yours that has 40 engineers or 40 employees or whatever it was, you know, that might feel like a big burden. I'm very impressed that you've already moved to Bazel with such a small outfit. You've saved yourself a lot of effort down the road. So I can tell you from someone who walked into this company with over 1,000 and I'm like, oh boy, we have a thing to do here. So good on you for that. It'll pay dividends.
I forgot the most important part for making it ergonomic for developers, which is that if you can Bazel behind the task runner command that their fingers have been trained to type, then they will be much less upset with you. So they can still do npm run something, and then the scripts can say Bazel do the thing. Then they don't have to learn the target syntax either until they get to the point where they outgrow the scripts that they've been used to calling. Same thing for make files, just have it call Bazel.
I should probably apologize. I've been in reliability. I totally appreciate reliability, and there's a lot of people up here that have been in reliability. So question I usually ask reliability engineers in interviews is like, what's the best incident that you've ever faced? And like dive in, like, and just try to talk with them about it. But since we're all talking about infrastructure here, and specifically Bazel infrastructure, like what's the most interesting failure case that you've seen that you can talk about?
Oh man, I had this one incident. So okay, this is a bit of like a humble brag, right? So the Buildbarn cluster that I used to maintain for a pretty long time was, you know, far too robust, and everybody got a bit sort of complacent about it. Like, you know, no, this can't be a Buildbarn issue, right? So we ended up having like a certain sort of outage that took far too long to resolve, and you know, we were just blaming it on the network instead of on the cluster, right? Because what happened, I had to do like a sort of a rolling upgrade of some of the storage nodes at Buildbarn, and then I also at around the same time had to do sort of a rolling upgrade of not just of the BB storage pods running on it, but the underlying node group, right? It also had to you know, get like an OS upgrade. And what I forgot to do was, even though on the storage nodes I had all these anti-affinity set up to make sure that obviously you don't want to have launch multiple storage pods on the same storage box, I forgot to annotate the front end processes that way. So what happened was that, you know,
We had that outage yesterday.
oh great. Yeah, so what happened was, you know, the cluster was all up and healthy, between quotes, you know, like all the storage nodes were healthy, but like all of the incoming traffic, outgoing traffic was all going through the single core VM system, whatever, right? It had to like, you know, tens of, you know, normally would get like tens of gigabits a second, or I don't know, even more likely, but it all had to go through a single box. So yeah, don't become complacent, which is really hard to do. Yeah, which direction?
Whichever.
Well, I feel like these folks are SREs over here.
Oh, no. You got a story?
Just repeat the same story.
Well, initially when I started in Fabrica, we were attempting to run Buildbarn on-prem on a couple beefy machines that we had started Kubernetes on, and we were running into some issues with the machines completely locking up, seemingly because of the disks. I mean, we were using commodity hardware at the time. This is during COVID, when it was impossible to get any any computer parts. And so, you know, we're doing builds on RGB gaming motherboards and anything we could find. And
Water cooled.
I believe so, actually, yeah. Sometimes. We finally traced it down after, you know, we decided to migrate to the cloud, and then we were debugging these machines, and it came all the way down to the Samsung consumer drives we were using in concert with the SATA controller having some incompatibility with each other. The Linux kernel seemed aware of, and there were kernel flags you could boot with that would, you know, boot with a bunch of flags and neuter the performance of your drives, and they work great. But then we had 2 SATA controllers on the machine, so we could plug all the drives into certain ports and everything would work fine. We can move them all to another set of ports and everything would blow up. So that was a lot of fun.
So the lesson there is don't use commodity hardware or?
NVMe. Spend some money.
So was it the big outage? I don't know. One issue we sometimes experienced was like that our cloud provider would give us these virtual machines where we were running like workers on them that had some kind of CPU bug, like a design flaw, production flaw that caused, you know, bit flips to happen sometimes. And, you know, it wouldn't get triggered through like ECC warnings or what have you. Like there would be absolutely no indicators from either the CPU or the memory controller or whatever that something went wrong. But we would sometimes just see these random compilation errors where, you know, a single character in a C++ file was being misread essentially, right? So we would say like, cannot find function promtf, right? Instead of, and then you'd look it up in the ASCII table and it would be like really just off by a single bit, right? So what we eventually did to detect this better was make it so what normally should never happen is that a worker tries to upload an output file to storage and the storage says, hey, you know, check some mismatch, right? And we were sometimes hitting that on those boxes. So we always had like this alert in Prometheus set up, right? If we see byte stream put to RPCs coming from workers that return like invalid argument or then just, you know, send a paging alert immediately, right? That's what we did. And that alert was then, you know, just sitting still for like a year or so, and then suddenly it hit again. And indeed, it was like another system that had a defect. The annoying part was that the cloud provider would just look at their metrics and see like, no, the system is fine. So then you'd file a support ticket and they would just release the system and, you know, repair it. But then like the specific person repairing the system would look at it, see that nothing was wrong, you know, shove it back into their data center or whatever. And then a day later, you'd get the alert again. So then it would sometimes take like a couple of weeks before that single system went out of rotation. So maybe running on bare metal is a bit easier because then you can always just get a baseball bat, smash the server, throw it out. Yeah.
When I was at Google working in hardware platforms, we sometimes referred to the clusters as gamma ray detectors. Because even with all the ECC and all the things, please, are you using ECC RAM if you're running on-prem, please? Oh my gosh. But I was joking earlier about what we had that outage yesterday. We were setting up a small, we're calling it a cell, a small Buildbarn cell. And there was a mistake where we were using raw block device with host path and we didn't have the anti-affinity set up. And so we had 2 storage nodes banging on exactly the same block device. And it took us a while to find that one, but importantly, I think the lesson there is it's the whole system, both Basil and Buildbarn are checking checksums constantly. And so it was a successful failure in my view, because what it manifests as, we expected this artifact ID, we got that artifact ID, and Basil gave you that error. And I'm like, and it looked like, what's wrong with Basil? Why is this target so terrible? Why is this target moving around that is so terrible? Like, you know, why is it non-deterministic? You know, but it smelled like it was Basil's fault because it's always Basil's fault. That's what happens when you're on the Basil team. But it turns out it was in fact the farm's fault. And but it was detected. Like those little tiny things. You build anything that's big enough, everything and anything will happen. And make sure that your system is never takes anything for granted.
Yeah, so I'm also like, you know, really happy to hear you ran into, no, not like this, but you know, when I implemented local blob access, I intentionally put features in there that like whenever it spots data corruption, that it just nukes a part of its storage, which is obviously annoying because you lose the cache, but then at least it's not as if like everything just keeps on hanging indefinitely.
Graceful degradation.
Yeah, exactly. So.
There you go.
As much as I love a great war story, this is a great segue into how do we bake all these things into a push button deploy that the rest of the planet can use? Because, you know, adopting Bazel is its own gigantic tangle of mess, but Buildbarn and, you know, any sort of a remote backend, you know, if it's this robust, if we can bake in all these lessons and someone just says, I want the Buildbarn backend and push a button, how do we get to that?
Send PRs.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and we've actually worked quite a lot on trying to make kind of we call it BB single, which was a container which contained all of the things that you wanted inside of Buildbarn, and it sacrifices on performance in order to be able to basically, well, get a machine, make sure it has enough disk, and then BB single will scale up until it runs out of the resources. And that kind of works. But the problem is that when you want to run this kind of infrastructure, you're running this kind of infrastructure for two reasons. One is that you have kind of a reference platform where your builds are run, so that things aren't that strange, and that you know that everything is running in something similar. And the second reason, which is often people's first reason, is they want performance. Once you start sacrificing performance for ease of deployment, and people become upset and want to make the deployment piece more difficult again. So I think there's theoretically possible to find something that works for. You can get a pretty big single machine today. Like you can get almost 200 cores. You can just push in 30 terabytes of NVMe in it and a bunch of RAM, and you could run a Buildbarn cluster that's capable of scaling up to a decent sized company. And that should be possible to do, but it's, yeah, you need to run that machine unless you want to pay a fortune to AWS, so.
Yeah, I think obviously Buildbarn is a fantastic set of software, and it's awesome that the fruit-related company where Ed worked was willing to open source it. But that company, of course, had a lot of deployment and you know, distributed systems infrastructure that I'm sure Ed and his team built around it that doesn't make sense for them to include in the open source because it's specific to their topology, the you know, their cost benefit analysis, what kind of hardware they have available, and I think it's an obvious lesson for everyone that Buildbarn doesn't include an infrastructure piece, and this is like, you know, what we're discussing, like how could you create such a thing? I think it's always a project that you have to take on within your company to like make an enterprise version of this that is that fits with the way that you do distributed systems deployments. Obviously, Aspect and Marathon also provide help around Buildbarn, so we have a certain amount of, you know, common Terraform and Helm configurations that make things easier to bring up, but then those things have a lot of parameters in them. And there's still a lot of things that you could get wrong. So I think, you know, in terms of sort of the war stories, the foot guns that exist in the platform, there's not an easy answer. So mostly agreeing with Benjamin.
Yeah, so one of what I want to mention is so with all of like the Buildbarn repos out there, of course, I really appreciate changes. But you know, for say BB storage, BB remote execution, you know, it's not as if I'm like blocking contributions, but I know I can sometimes be somewhat of a picky person, right? I tend to sort of put the bar a bit too high maybe for some other people, especially if they're like just want to do like a drive-by change and, you know, I just want to get this issue fixed. And then I say like, well, this is great. Let's take a ride and, you know, use the time to also do some other refactoring, right? I'm pretty sure you also experienced that. Sorry about that. But with what I want to say is like, you know, without going into too much detail, indeed, it is pretty hard for me to maintain example deployments, right? So that's also one of the reasons that for like BP deployments, it's sort of like anyone can contribute, and I'm especially there, I've been like adding more people, giving other people sort of direct write access to the repo, right? I want the repo to do well, right? So if you're using something that already like resembles the example deployments, or you want to like get your kind of deployment in there, or please go contribute to that repo, reach out to me, reach out to some of the other people who did commits there, and like the sort of barrier to sort of entry is intentionally low for that repo. Yeah.
Yeah, I won't say too much more than that, because I do hit this note in the talk that we're about to give. But yeah, the BB deployment repo, it really is hello world, not hello load. Like it gets you off the ground, like the minimum imaginable thing that can do more than one action at a time. But it doesn't do it in the top class way. And I think that's the part that's missing. So I think, there's some contributions may be coming. But I've also given some thought to, the more general question is like, obviously parameters. Your Terraform must be loaded with parameters because everyone's deployment is in fact different. Everyone has a different shaped build, a different user base, blah, blah, blah. And different hardware they're running on, whatever it is. And I was kind of wondering if there's an opportunity here to model it after some of the Kubernetes controller-based deployment solutions out there. I'm familiar with Rook Ceph, Ceph being the storage platform. Rook is a Kubernetes controller layer on top of it. I'm running it on junk hardware at home, and it can just like do it. And it's kind of like amazing, but it also has knobs. So I don't know if it would be a large investment, but if anyone is thinking about, hey, could I make a completely runs itself build barn out of Kubernetes deployments, look at Rook Ceph, see how they do it, see if there's lessons learned. I would love to see someone contribute something like that.
Yeah, so even though I sometimes have my sort of reservations towards controllers, Kubernetes controllers, they're sometimes a bit messy. I do agree with you on this one. And I think what would be like really useful to sort of have integrated into a controller is also a system that can assist you in properly sort of maintaining a mirrored sharded storage setup.
Exactly. That's where the correlation to Ceph comes in.
Yeah, and also getting the upgrade strategies for that, right?
Yeah, right.
So if you say like, hey, bump this, that is not just saying like, YOLO, in place, replace all the storage pods. That it actually knows like, okay, now looking at the uptimes of these pods, I see storage A is, 8 hours old, B is 5 days old. If I'm going to now restart, like if I need to replace one, I better pick A that's only eight hours old, because otherwise we only have a retention left of 8 hours, which is far too low, right? That actually has some smartness in it to make good decisions about which half to pick, and
To his point about encoding wisdom.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, good point for bringing that up.
There's,
One of the aspects I really appreciate about Buildbarn is it's a little bit more configuration heavy than some other software out there. Some binaries you can think of.
Composable.
It is. It's very composable. I mean, some binaries, it's a monolithic binary, and then you run it with a flag to run it in this mode or that mode. But BB storage doesn't really make any have any preconceived notions about what kind of storage topology you want, if it's mirrored or sharding, or if it's going to have a read fallback cache over here or whatnot, which really makes it like a library of pieces for you to then build out something, do things like, oh yeah, let's have an office specific pull through cache, things like that. But having that amount of configuration is kind of at odds with having something that's simple to set up.
Yeah, I joke. I actually, sometimes I find the code a little bit hard to read because you have to start from the configuration to even understand how any of it fits together. Once you understand that, you could read the code, but otherwise you're kind of like, this is just this piece. Like, where's this Lego brick go in this thing that I'm trying to build?
I wanted to chip in one thing here. I think right now with the state of where things are at with cloud providers, if we make this too easy, this could be easily like a money spending machine. Like no relation to like what we're doing. Like as professionals, we know what we're running, we know what kind of resources we're using. And the idea of something that's really easy that like suddenly spins up thousands of EC2 machines or something like that, I think could definitely be like a mega foot gun.
Are you saying we should get a cut?
Maybe.
But that's true, and it comes to Alex's point about having sufficient configuration, because if it tries to be the one size fits all, which would be the risk of adding another set of Kubernetes manifests to B2B deployment. It's like, here's like the Excel version of that has all the bells and whistles turned on, which might be 80% more complexity than you need in order to do what you're doing, and you're going to pay so much more for it. And I think just as we kind of made the mistake of saying, oh, we'll just use these manifests that do hello world and just tweak them, and then you realize actually our infrastructure looks nothing like that anymore. People make the alternate mistake and be like, oh wow, Buildbarn is really expensive to run. I'm just using these manifests from the website, and this is apparently what it takes. This is what they're telling me it takes. I'm afraid to run it any differently because this is now a critical piece of our infrastructure, and things go badly for the whole company when it's not working right. And so that could actually be reputationally harmful. So I think we need to be very careful.
Yeah, exactly. That was also sort of one of the reasons why I didn't want to make it too easy was indeed. So my worst fear is that people then, onboard Bazel, Buildbarn, they've got it fully running for like half a year, company depends on it. And then suddenly it breaks and nobody knows how to fix it, right?
Yeah.
So that's why the onboarding process of Buildbarn, tried to sort of make it a bit more Spartan, manual, because by the time you've sort of managed to get it all up and running, then getting sharding working is doable, right? And getting initial size classes working is also doable, and yeah.
This may be more about documentation than example.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought up cost, and it's 2025 and we're at a tech conference and I'm only now bringing up AI. The volume of, generated PRs is increasing for everybody's organization. And, in addition to the possible mistake of over provisioning that comes with like a standard template, comes the fact that the workloads are likely to keep increasing over the next few years. And so a lot of what we do in tuning for our platform, and I'm sure other administrators see this as well, is that you're looking at all the dashboarding, and we saw some great examples of like Grafana. First of all, you have to interpret like, are all of these spikes that I see here intent like good behavior, or are those problems? And then when you understand that, then you have sort of two choices to make generally. There's sort of the, and it depends on your budget and your willingness to throw more money at the problem, right? Which is like you can provision more, or you can dig into how to make the system more efficient with what you have.
So related to Buildbarn setup and configuration, I'm curious if you guys like have those like configuration or setup that after you adopt, you feel, damn, it's very helpful to my system. I would like to hear more about those like story, like say you have those specific configurations, feature setup in your system. Yeah.
He's asking about like, are there specific configurations that have been especially helpful that aren't maybe obvious?
Oh, sorry. So this is a really good question. Actually, when Trey gave a talk, I made a note like, hey, I should really bring this up at some point today. And now I've forgotten. No, well, you reminded me. So there are some people that are that want to run a Buildbarn on bare metal hardware, right? And Trey, you're making use of Kubernetes for that, right? One of the annoying things of running Kubernetes on bare metal hardware is that you don't just need to care about running kubelet, the API server etcd, but you also need to make use of, was it kubeproxy, core DNS, a CNI, blah, 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 blah. In like recent versions of Buildbarn, whenever you configure a gRPC client, there is an sort of option where you can say, I don't want you to use DNS resolution to find like the system you need to connect to. I want you to actually talk to the API server use that to do the resolution and connect to it. Which means that for certain types of clusters, you can just completely rip out the CNI part out of it. Don't run kubeproxy, don't run core DNS. Just have a simple Kubernetes cluster that only has an API server, and on the systems in the cluster, you only run kubelet. And then still those worker pods that you're running on them, they can connect to other systems in the cluster, right? You can just schedule everything with host networking and then say connect to this service, and it will just like talk to the API server, get it back and then connect to it.
We heard you talk about that before. So it sounds really interesting, yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking about
So instead of it's always DNS, it's never DNS, like.
So, sorry, what's that?
Instead of it's always DNS, it's now never DNS, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I could be wrong.
Google was shut.
Yeah, and speaking of like configurations that you should really keep a track of, you need to have an entry point to your server somewhere, like, oh, I want to send the traffic in here. Just make sure it's not a layer 7 proxy. I can't tell you how many times I've arrived at a place and asked them, do you use application level load balancer? They tell me, what's that? And then it turns out the problem is that it's an application level load balancer. This is a pretty traffic heavy thing. Like even like Amazon's own application load balancer won't be able to keep up.
gRPC is HTTP, right? And then they just run it through Squid, or I don't know what, they run it for just an arbitrary HTTP proxy or something and then expect it to work.
Cool. So you mentioned tuning for a little bit. And I assume there's a lot of tuning to be done on like how much resources you allocate to Buildbarn. Is there anything, I'm also curious about what is the frontier and techniques needed for that tuning? And maybe not just how you allocate resources, but also how teams like manage their dependencies, or how teams write like really long tests, how you kind of manage like, if you had a critical path through your build, how you would go about like burning down that critical path. Sorry.
Oh, this is a very big question. There's something that when you're responsible for the infrastructure, the best you can do is make sure that infrastructure performs well and that it reports information in a way that's consumable from the developers. Because in the end, even if I get a report that the cluster is spending 70% of its time generating documentation, I can sort of guess that's not what they intended to do. But someone who actually has the domain knowledge of what does this script do, what does it produce, has to be able to see that and say, hey, I don't want to pay $100,000 a month just to generate documentation on every commit. So it's too wide of a question to give a good answer to. And try to expose as much information as possible to developers in tooling that the developers themselves are aware of how to use and how to drill down deeper into. And just talk with your budget people about how much can we spend compared to how much can we have our cluster queue things up.
Yeah, I've spoken about this a lot. The Bazel makes it very easy for developers to have dependencies, right? You put an import statement in your source file. Now Gazelle runs and adds a dep. The dep now means that anytime somebody changes this library over here, now your application or your really long running test is now a cache miss. There's an agency problem that now you as the developer of this thing added an import statement, and it's not making your life slow, it's making the life slow for people elsewhere in the graph. And that's one of many sort of governance issues that you run into that really goes all the way back to good software development practices and layering. Like, why did you make an import from that thing? You would need tech leads to be looking at things like visibility in Bazel to say that it's, we have the layering for a reason, and so this dependency shouldn't be allowed. To Benjamin's point, like what can, a developer is generally not going to understand Bazel in much depth. And, the topics we're talking about are quite technically deep, especially things that pertain to the behavior of the cluster. I think that and developers don't spend, they're mad for a moment while CI is running, and then assuming they're able to merge, then they go on to their next feature. And so that moment when they're mad, I think, is an important thing to leverage. by exactly showing them things like, why did my change even trigger this really slow integration test? Every time this test is running, I start to get up, a little anxious because it's flaky, and that's their opportunity to, even if they're not the person who controls it, at least try to escalate to someone and be the squeaky wheel to improve software development practices.
So a piece of software that I'd like to see appear at some point in time is so with the fuse file system that Buildbarn has, which you can use on the workers to sort of fetch input files on demand. There's this prefetching option, which is sort of like a feedback-driven process. So instead of downloading the entire input route every time an action runs, like once an action is completed, it writes out a Bloom filter into storage that sort of stores which of the paths are being accessed. And then the next time an action with a similar shape is being run, that Bloom filter is reloaded, and then the action is just getting started immediately without like downloading any data up front. But while it's running, there's sort of a thread running in the background, a BB worker that will try to race the build action to see like, okay, the build action is going to access all the input files sequentially, but in the background, there's like, a thread pool that's trying to fetch the files that it expects that the action is going to need. What's interesting about these Bloom filters is what a lot of people don't. So even if they set this up, they forget to enable it in BB browser as well, because if you enable it in BB browser, then actually, if you sort of go inspect the input route, then all the file names become green and red based on whether like it, what's in the Bloom filter. So it's sort of like an approximation where you can sort of see like, what is this action going to, like, what's getting prefetched next time the action runs? Or in other words, what is likely going to be needed by this action? It would be really nice if all that data would somehow get aggregated and be a bit more accessible, where you just had a page that says like, which are the actions in my cluster that have like crazy big input routes but hardly use anything at all, right? Because that would be really good for like pruning inputs, false dependencies of actions. Yeah.
I'm sure Bazel has a feature, I forget when it was added, to list the unused inputs that an action observed, and like that would be amazing because most developers don't know which those are, and the rule set can't tell, but if you can tell empirically at runtime what was accessed through the file system, then you could feed that back to Bazel, and then you would have gotten a cache hit and the action never would have been dispatched to the executor to begin
Does
with.
that feature only work with the sandbox then?
It uses the virtual file system when it's running remotely to determine whether or not something has been accessed.
So wait, which feature are we talking about now? Because is it this feature in Bazel? That's
The Bazel feature.
Oh,
No, I don't think it depends on the environment that the action executes at all. It just affects whether the cache key is considered a hit. In other words, I think it discards, if changes were only made to files in the unused input list, then you would get a cache hit.
So I know which specific feature you're talking about. So this is not like a general purpose feature for like arbitrary commands, but there is a feature in Bazel where if you've got a C++ action, it generates both like this compile action generates both the .o file, like the object file, but it also generates this .d file with like the dependencies. And that's being fed into Bazel again.
Yeah.
So as long as you don't shut down Bazel, keep it running, then it makes use of that to sort of prove the
Use
dependencies.
JDEPs similarly.
Probably so,
Alright.
yeah. Yeah, that's a feature you were talking about, right? Yeah.
I assume it's funded similarly.
Yeah, but that features, requires explicit compiler support, of course, because the compiler needs to emit which files are being accessed. But it would be pretty sweet if somehow, Buildbarn was able to sort of convey that data back to Bazel for arbitrary actions.
RAV3.
Don't get me started about
Did I
this.
say a 4-letter word?
Not just compilers, but like rules OCI that builds container images also emits this unused input list, which can have a really large build avoidance, especially because those artifacts are so big.
And perhaps all of you guys are a little bit too old for this, but if you know somebody who's currently studying, we have a master thesis offer for anyone who wants to study this subject at Marathon out right now, so.
Yeah, so all living costs in Sweden are being reimbursed, and it's really nice country, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Come live in Sweden.
All right, one last question.
So
So we talked a little bit about standard configurations and things that can help people get off the ground or have some safety around, hey, you know, like if I run Buildbarn in this way, then I'm more than likely going to be mostly okay. What we found, I think, is that the setup that makes you successful with Buildbarn, at least our experience is, it depends a lot on the workload you send, very much. And so I'm not convinced that there's any one particular configuration that's going to make anything but a pretty standard code base successful. How much do you think we should invest in Buildbarn being able to auto-diagnose what's wrong when things start going wrong? So for example, you can observe, right? You can go into Grafana metrics and stuff like that and see, I'm seeing some sort of like choking point here, or the cache is falling behind or something like that. To what extent can we make it easier for people to say, hey, I have money up to this amount. If I take some from here and put it there, then the farm will become balanced again for the workload that we're now sending to it, because workloads evolve as well.
Yeah.
And so the configuration needs to change over time. And so we're building expertise. We got a lot better at it. But can we make it easier? Do we think that it's an important problem to solve?
So this is not really an answer to your question, but maybe if such a thing, if we wanted to spend time on that, maybe that could be done as part of like work of designing an operator, right? Because an operator could also be a good tool for like monitoring the cluster and, you know, adjusting.
Rebalancing.
Yeah, yeah. But I have no further thoughts on that. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, gather the metrics and then build a relevant team and percentage of the cost of the cluster depending on how they use it. And then usually problems kind of resolve themselves automatically at that point. Not always, but it's a good motivation for the teams to fix their things.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some of the size class features could maybe alleviate what you're some of the issues you're seeing with different workloads. You know, if they can be expressed as different size classes, and Buildbarn can kind of dynamically figure out what sorts of workers it would rather have. And then if you're, you know, on Kubernetes where you can auto scale your size class pods differently, then you have a system that can start to dynamically balance itself. And then we've also you know, in Fabrica, we're dealing with workloads that maybe have very specific CPU requirements and things like that, where we have to do it more statically. We have to find a way to have certain rules and force them onto a certain worker pool that then auto scales separately. So that's also an option. But some of these limitations are inherent to the remote execution APIs, I think, unfortunately. Like there's not a lot of resource information going back and forth and trying to shoehorn it into you know what some of the key value pairs there is. I just don't think the API is as expressive as you'd want it to be if you want to really dial it in.
Sure, and we are running, you know, multiple pools of workers and all of that. I guess I was also talking about what's the right size of cache. Do we need to change other aspects of besides the execution part of the farm? Yeah, she's gonna answer my.
No, I'm not gonna.
It's just being handed over to me. Right. Yeah, it's a really good one, right? Especially like, you know, cache adjusting, right? The nice thing is that for certain subsystems in Buildbarn, like everything except local blob X is which is odd because local blob X is actually like one of the most important ones. We do have like a uniform way of exposing metrics. Like people hardly ever query the eviction set metrics, right? There's this simple data structure in Buildbarn for, you know, implementing sort of LRU sort of cache replacement. And for that, we offer generic metrics. So everything that uses that eviction set library has Prometheus metrics for it, which is pretty great. So that they could be used as like a basis for determining whether cache is appropriately sized, or at least have a system that like warns you like, hey, you know, this is not effective at all, right? You should do something. So as part of the Prometheus rules that we already released in BB deployments, there's absolutely no alerts in there as far as I know, right? They, that's also basically sort of like a best effort code drop from my end, like those dashboards, but maybe it would be nice if, for those kinds of common things like having alerts for, eviction sets, having poor hit rates, that kind of stuff, that we also had some predefined alerts for that people could use.
And I think
right?
that's part of the same story that Kevin, I think that's part of the same story that Kevin brought up, is like encoding the wisdom.
Yeah.
It's not just about the deployment automation, but also about the observability, and the alerting is part of that story. I think that could be pretty helpful.
All right, I'd like to thank the panel and a round of applause for folks. We'll take a quick 5-minute break and come back to another presentation.